His own White House marches openly in the streets with the KKK. So this dude is a racist, no good scumbag.
Explain to people Woodrow Wilson's role in critical race theory. This kind of fascinated me.
Yeah, so Woodrow Wilson was a professor in 1902. He came out with a 5-volume set. I actually have that set here right here beside me. It's The History of American People. And in this 5-volume set, Woodrow Wilson goes through and essentially chronological starts from the beginning and goes up to their present day. What's worth noting is this 5-volume set, very successful, increased his notoriety. He actually became the president of Princeton University shortly after, and he was actually the first president of Princeton who was not actually a pastor, which is also interesting because Princeton, like most early universities, were founded as Bible colleges and were run by churches and by pastors. But he's the first president that wasn't a gospel minister. Well, he became so famous as this president at Princeton, and because he had done this 5-volume set on American history, that people said, hey, we need someone as smart as you running for president. And so he ends up getting elected to be president. As president, and here's where you kind of start to see the color of who he is. As president, he showed the very first ever film on the White House. It was called The Birth of a Nation. He actually gave it 2 viewings. And The Birth of a Nation was actually the recruiting film for the KKK. Woodrow Wilson was an incredible racist. Also, if you remember at the end of the Civil War, during the Civil War, you had units that were not segregated, right? We know there was a mass 54th, a mass 55th. We know there were black units, but at the end of the Civil War, you begin to have integrated units. As you go forward with the Spanish-American War, and as you look in the late 1800s, we had integrated units with black and white serving together. When World War I starts, Woodrow Wilson says, nope, we need to segregate the military again because whites and blacks shouldn't be together. Well, Woodrow Wilson is the guy who helps bring the reintroduction of the KKK. The rebirth of the KKK happens under his leadership, largely under his administration. His own White House marches openly in the streets with the KKK. So this dude is a racist, no good scumbag. And there's lots of reasons he was a bad guy, but racism certainly not the least of those. Here's where it becomes significant with his 5-volume history set. In his 5-volume history set, he removed every single black American from American history. So there's not a mention of a single black person. And if you think about it, he's writing in 1902. So the end of the Civil War, Frederick Douglass, incredibly famous person in American history. In fact, Frederick Douglass was photographed more times than Abraham Lincoln. Everybody knows Frederick Douglass. In fact, at this point, everybody knows George Washington Carver. Everybody knows Booker T. Washington. But Woodrow Wilson says, yeah, we're not including blacks in what we do because he was a racist. Well, he was also one of the leaders of the progressive movement. And as the progressives took over education, they used his history books as the standard for history in public schools. And therefore, they included no black heroes, which is actually part of why decades later, they said we need to have Black History Month so we can celebrate these contributions. They're returning to just learning some of those basic stories of American heroes that Woodrow Wilson had expelled. And this is still much of what we are doing in public schools today is following the narrative of Woodrow Wilson, where he said, we're not going to celebrate any of these black heroes because as a racist, he didn't want to talk about black people at all, mention no names. But that is part of the stain. And by the way, it's worth noting that this was a white Democrat president. If you talk about these racist acts in American history, by and large, you see them being committed by white Democrats. This is just kind of the mantra of the Democrat Party for the history of the Democrat Party. But Woodrow Wilson was the guy who largely removed these heroes from our history.